On a cold winter morning in March of 1970, 29-year-old Robert Hamrick, chief of the Rock Creek, Ohio Police Department, made his final radio transmission. Chief Hamrick reported that he was involved in a high-speed pursuit, and then nothing. Just silence and intermittent radio static. Nearly 2 hours later, a deputy from the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department was sent to try and locate Chief Hamrick. Arriving at his last known location, the deputy discovered the twisted wreck of Hamrick's police cruiser. The chief had seemingly lost control on the icy road and collided with a tree at a high rate of speed. He was hurt bad, but he was still breathing. Chief Hamrick was rushed to the hospital but would never regain consciousness. He succumbed to his injuries 9 arduous days later. Almost immediately, the rumors began. This had been no accident. Chief Hamrick had been lured out to the middle of nowhere, forced off the road, and beaten. His assailants had then placed his battered body back inside the cruiser, turned off the engine, and extinguished the lights, leaving him there to die. Much to the shock of locals, friends, and family members, the Sheriff's Department would rule that Chief Hamrick had died from the car accident and the car accident alone. Case files were closed, but those who loved the chief would never forget. More than 20 years later, the case would be reopened following the airing of an Unsolved Mysteries episode and the continuing growth of rumors and speculation. Was this simply an accident from the chief driving fast on an icy gravel back road? Or was it possible that Hamrick's murder had been covered up by corrupt officials to keep their stories from hitting the front page? This is Trace Evidence, episode 195, The Mysterious Death of Robert Hamrick. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious death of Robert Hamrick, a case which has stuck with me ever since I first saw it on Unsolved Mysteries all the way back in 1991. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter @TraceEvPod, Instagram @TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon at patreon.com/TraceEvidence, or you can donate directly via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or email me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Just 8 months after being sworn in as chief of the Rock Creek Police Department, Robert Hamrick would be dead. While it was ultimately determined that Chief Hamrick had died as the result of a car accident, many believe that what truly happened that night was covered up by those trusted to enforce the law. This is episode 195, The Mysterious Death of Robert Hamrick. "45 miles east of Cleveland's busy city center sits the small village of Rock Creek. Tucked tightly between Austinburg to the north and Rome to the south, Rock Creek is home to a small community amidst a vast swath of rural land less than 20 miles from the Pennsylvania border. Residing inside the borders of Ashtabula County, Rock Creek began as a small, quiet, backwoods town, and more than 150 years later, it hasn't ever really shifted beyond that box, as its population, ebbing and flowing throughout the decades, has never surpassed 1,000 residents, and at its peak in the 1970s, was home to just under 800. Ohio State Route 45, running north to south, passes directly through Rock Creek and is considered the main thoroughfare for most travelers passing by the area and residents heading out of town. Main Street is home to an assortment of private houses and businesses where new construction and older, well-maintained structures meet abandoned and boarded-up buildings in a strange dichotomy of a town both of the past and moving beyond it. As is the case with many small towns, Venturing just a few miles beyond the village opens up a great number of back roads cutting between patches of wilderness and the dusty greenery of open fields and farmland, like little gray lines slicing through and dividing shades of brown and green. Like many small towns, Rock Creek has a history it's proud of, and many residents who can harken back to when their grandparents or great-grandparents emigrated to the area and began shaping what would eventually become their home. There are, of course, always darker stories lingering just beneath the surface in every small town across this country. Cautionary tales passed down over the generations, and while most can be easily dismissed as legend or exaggeration, there are some whose true dark origins remain intact, and those are the stories people tend to stray away from, not seeking to pass too closely to the specter of tumultuous and tragic events best left forgotten. This week, however, one of those stories is exactly what I'm here to tell you. Callender Road is one of those lesser-traveled paths cutting through the rural outskirts of town, and it's home to one of Rock Creek's most disturbing mysteries. Running for 5 miles from Windsor-Mechanicsville Road in the east to Rome Rock Creek Road in the west, it's almost perfectly divided in two where State Route 45 intersects. It was at this intersection in March of 1970 that Rock Creek Police Chief Robert Hamrick made his final call over the radio. Just before 2 a.m. on a bitterly cold Wednesday morning, Chief Hamrick radioed in that he was in a high-speed pursuit heading south along 45, heading out of Rock Creek. Moments later, the chief came across the band once more, his voice difficult to discern through the screaming of the sirens and the rushing of wind. The pursuit, he reported, had turned westbound onto Callender Road. Then the radio went silent. Nearly 2 hours later, the dispatcher grew concerned when multiple calls into Chief Hamrick went unanswered. Finally, getting a deputy on the line, the dispatcher directed him towards Callender Road, the last known location of the chief. It didn't take long to discover the reason for Hamrick's silence. His cruiser was found towards the western end of the road, partially smashed in from a heavy collision with a tree. Thick skid marks cut into the dirt roadway where patches of ice, hidden in the grooves of the dirt, seemingly told the story of the accident. White puffs of snow fell from the black sky as the deputy rushed towards the vehicle, finding Chief Hamrick badly injured, but breathing. The chief would be pulled from the twisted steel and rushed to the local hospital, but they didn't have the skilled surgeons he would need, and within hours of the crash, Hamrick was flown via helicopter to the Cleveland Clinic, where he would linger for 9 days before passing away. At the time, investigators told a fairly understandable story. In the midst of a high-speed pursuit, Chief Hamrick had lost control of his vehicle while maneuvering through an S-curve on Callender Road. His vehicle slid sideways off the dirt road, slamming into a tree with such force that the car bounced backwards several feet. Chief Hamrick, who was known for almost never wearing a seatbelt, had sustained traumatic head injuries during the crash, and by the time he was found nearly 2 hours later, his chance of survival had decreased dramatically. The surgeons in Cleveland did everything that they could, but it appeared the 29-year-old police chief's injuries were beyond their abilities as well. It had all been a terribly tragic accident. Or had it been? News travels fast in small towns, and within hours of Hamrick's accident, a massive game of telephone had already begun. From residents along Callender Road to neighboring communities, there were already whispers of something obscene, something suspicious. A cover-up, a lie, a narrative given to the people to quench their thirst for more information, perhaps information that might shine a light on some not-so-savory behaviors involving members of the community, the sheriff's department, even the local government. At the heart of these rumors, however, was one simple question which needed to be answered. What really happened to Chief Robert Hamrick that night? Well, that story isn't as cut and dry as you might imagine. Robert Hamrick was born on Wednesday, May 29, 1940 in Wyden, West Virginia, to parents Forrest and Hattie Mae Hamrick. Robert would be the third child born to the couple, coming home to meet an older brother and sister, 2 and 3 years his senior. As a child, Robert's been described as a kind and adventurous boy who enjoyed spending his time out in the sun, getting dirty in the woods, and exploring to his heart's content. Hard work was a built-in responsibility back in those days, and Robert knew how to help carry the load, putting in whatever effort he could to assist his parents and to make life easier for the family. While little is known publicly about Robert's early life, some details have managed to make their way into the spotlight. Living in West Virginia, Robert would go on to attend Clay County High School. According to genealogical documents, Robert served in the military as well, with his rank at discharge being listed as private first class. On Friday, May 24, 1963, just days before his 23rd birthday, Robert married Myrtle Sawyers at the First Church of God in Ashtabula County, Ohio. Together, the couple would go on to have 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. By 1965, when Robert was 25 years old, he, Myrtle, and the family had settled into Ashtabula County. Robert would go on to begin a career in law enforcement when in the spring of 1965 he joined the Geneva-on-the-Lake Police Department as a patrolman. For the next 4 years, Hamrick would work for that department, earning himself a reputation as a hard-nosed officer who didn't play any games. This reputation may have played a role in the village of Rock Creek turning their attention towards him in the summer of 1969. According to Unsolved Mysteries, Rock Creek citizens were growing frustrated with the rising crime, much of which had been attributed to a motorcycle gang that was hanging around town, threatening locals, stealing cars, and allegedly running drugs. Now, whether or not this representation is accurate has been the subject of a lot of debate, as many locals and law enforcement officers in the area have argued that the term gang may have been an overstatement. At least one member of this so-called gang later stated in an interview with the sheriff's office that the gang mentality was laughable, as there were only 4 motorcycle owners in all of Rock Creek. At the time, in the late 1960s, the village of Rock Creek depended on the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department for all of their law enforcement needs. However, the Sheriff's Department was limited in both resources and manpower, leaving only a small group of officers with the overwhelming responsibility of keeping law and order in a county consisting of nearly 100,000 residents spread out over 1,400 square miles. In response to the lack of readily available officers, local residents of Rock Creek began feeling that they might need their own police department to help offset the rising crime rates that the Sheriff's Department was not equipped to handle. In January of 1969, David Schlecht, the mayor of Rock Creek, ordered the creation of the Rock Creek Police Department following petitions brought forth by the local community. At the time, Mayor Schlecht swore in the department's first chief, but within the first 6 months of the department's existence, he had twice sworn in chiefs and twice accepted their resignations. At the time, it was reported that after taking the job, both chiefs had become the subject of intense harassment campaigns conducted by who, at the time, they referred to as the Rock Creek Gang. While exact details of the harassment have not been publicly released, other members of law enforcement have stated that it ran the full gamut, from intimidation to threatening phone calls to outright assault. Then, in July of 1969, 29-year-old Robert Hamrick was sworn in as the 3rd chief of police. Determined to get the town under control, Hamrick immediately set out to break up the local troublemakers and restore order to Rock Creek. Unfortunately, he too would quickly become the subject of harassment and threats. His wife, Myrtle, later explained to Unsolved Mysteries, saying, quote, "He wanted it to be a nice, friendly town, and he wanted to get this gang off the streets so that people wouldn't have to be afraid of them. They just did anything they could to aggravate him when they knew he was home. He would get fed up and take off after them." End quote. For the first few months of his time as chief, Robert didn't deal with too many big crimes. Mostly his policing revolved around serving warrants and issuing tickets for traffic infractions. However, that would all change 5 months later in December of '69. While on patrol near the outskirts of town, Hamrick sighted several individuals hanging out and then entering an abandoned building. Waiting until he saw the group leaving the area, Robert made his way inside the decaying structure and was shocked by what he found. Sitting parked in the middle of this mess was an expensive sports car in immaculate condition. A quick check of the license plate returned what Hamrick had expected. The vehicle had recently been reported stolen. Wanting to catch the thieves in the act, Hamrick called in backup from the department and was joined by patrolman Gary Martin, among others. Martin detailed the incident to Unsolved Mysteries, saying, quote, "We came across it, fingerprinted it, and we bugged the building because we didn't know who was there. We put a radio in our car and just drove around and listened until the guys came back." End quote. While Martin remained on patrol, listening intently, Chief Hamrick remained behind, concealing himself in an old office inside the building. When the group of men returned, Hamrick jumped out with his service revolver drawn and held the men until Martin and other officers arrived. The men were quickly arrested and charged with, among other things, grand theft auto. While none of the men arrested were directly named, it has been strongly implied that they were members of this so-called Rock Creek gang. Seemingly, it was this bust which escalated the issues between Hamrick and the gang, as the harassment he experienced ratcheted up dramatically. All of those arrested were released on bail, and it appeared they now had a much stronger investment in convincing Chief Hamrick to hang up his badge as the two previous chiefs had. According to Myrtle, from this time forward, Robert would make sure that when he was home, he was the one who answered the phone, as the threatening calls were becoming more frequent. One evening in February of 1970, while Robert was on duty, Myrtle answered the phone and was horrified by what she heard. She explained, quote, "There was a man on the other end, and he said, 'Tell your husband to leave things alone and get him out of town, or he's going to be hurt, and he's going to be hurt bad.'" End quote. 1 month later, this threat would come true. Chief Hamrick had been working a varied schedule at the time, sometimes actively on duty during the day, and other times he'd be on overnight shifts. On the evening of Tuesday, March 10th, 1970, Hamrick was set to work one of those long, lonely night shifts. As far as has been reported, the evening of the 10th passed without so much action for the chief, who was making his way through town, watching traffic, and checking in on the local bar where members of the gang often gathered. As the clock flipped over into the early morning hours of Wednesday, March 11th, the town was mostly shut down and there were few vehicles on the road. At the time, due to the small size of the Rock Creek Police Department, they weren't yet equipped to have their own radio dispatcher, and so all calls would be handled by the Ashtabula Sheriff's Department. At approximately 1:50 a.m., Chief Hamrick came across the radio band and reported that he was involved in a high-speed pursuit. He gave his location as traveling southbound on State Route 45, moving out of Rock Creek, heading towards the town of Rome. That night, Deputy Dispenza was working the radio and received the chief's call. Hamrick reported that he was chasing a two-door hardtop 1968 Rambler with the license plate SR775, and he requested that the deputy run down the vehicle's owner. Just over a minute later, at 1:51 a.m., Chief Hamrick radioed in for the last time, reporting to Dispenza that the pursuit had turned off Route 45 and was now moving westbound along rural Callender Road. After several minutes passed without an update, Deputy Dispenza attempted to raise Hamrick on the radio, but received no response. In an interview with the Akron Beacon Journal, Deputy Dennis Chapman, one of only 2 deputies on duty that night, reported that he recalled hearing Chief Hamrick's pursuit call over the radio and planned to assist him. At 1:51 a.m., he was approximately 30 miles from Rock Creek and began making his way towards Callender Road, but his vehicle was struck by another driver. As a result of the accident, Deputy Chapman had to remain at the scene until the Ohio Highway Patrol arrived and completed an accident report. Over the course of the next hour and a half, Deputy Chapman didn't hear any other calls over the radio and assumed that Chief Hamrick had either arrested the driver or had been forced to abandon the chase after the vehicle passed beyond the borders of Rock Creek and out of his jurisdiction. At approximately 3:43 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the chief had made his last call, Deputy Chapman reported being contacted over the radio by Deputy Dispenza, who explained that Hamrick had not been in contact since that last call and multiple attempts to reach him had gone unanswered. Directed back towards Callender Road, Deputy Chapman set off to try and locate the chief, who he assumed may have encountered some kind of vehicle trouble along the rural dirt and gravel road. Chapman explained that it was a cold night and the roads weren't good. As he passed by Rock Creek, the night grew darker, and when he made the turn onto Calendar Road, he only had his headlights to illuminate the way as he was surrounded by empty fields and darkness on all sides. Heading west, Chapman maneuvered through a double S-shaped curve in the road, and as he came out of it, his headlights immediately highlighted the chief's cruiser. Chapman explained, quote, "It was so dark and so cold you could see your breath. The only thing I could see was the shield on the car." End quote. This, in and of itself, was a bit strange as Chapman couldn't in that moment understand why both the vehicle and the police lights were turned off. Rushing towards the car, which had obviously impacted a tree at a high rate of speed, Chapman explained to Unsolved Mysteries that he found Chief Hamrick alive, semi-conscious and seriously injured. According to Chapman, Chief Hamrick was thrashing around in the front seat, perhaps seizing. Chapman tried speaking to Hamrick, though he couldn't tell if the chief could hear him or not, and he quickly radioed for an ambulance and a wrecker. He explained to Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "He had head and facial injuries. I was surprised to find him moving when I got there. And then my next thing was to keep him from moving so that he wouldn't do further injury to himself." End quote. Deputy Chapman's radio call for emergency medical services came across the band at 3:45 a.m. according to a report filed by William Johnston, then a corporal with the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department, who was shift commander that evening. Corporal Johnston quickly flipped on his lights and siren and began making his way towards Calendar Road, approximately 15 miles south of his position along US 20 in Saybrook Township. Corporal Johnston arrived at the scene at 4 a.m. according to his report, and upon being informed of what had happened by Deputy Chapman, Johnston turned his attention towards Chief Hamrick. In his incident report, Johnston wrote, quote, "Deputy Chapman went on to say that he was checking Calendar Road when he found A5 had run off the road on the south side, striking a tree with the left front end of his patrol car, A5. Deputy Chapman advised me that the chief was very badly hurt. I went over to Chief Hamrick in A5 and found him half sitting and half laying on the center part of the front seat. The chief's head was a mass of blood, and he had swelling of the facial area. The chief was gasping for air, and it sounded like he had an open chest wound. Further checking revealed that he did not have an open chest wound. He was still gasping for air. Deputy Chapman then informed me that when he arrived at the scene, he found that all the lights, emergency lights, and ignition were in the off position. I found out later that these were the emergency light switches that I saw. The ignition and the emergency equipment were shut off when I checked the vehicle. It was hard to get right inside the car to check closer because of the chief being in the position that he was and being hurt so badly. When Miller's ambulance arrived, Deputy Chapman and myself helped to get Chief Hamrick out of the wrecked car. I then told Deputy Chapman to make a thorough search of the accident scene and to fill out a complete accident report. I told Deputy Chapman that I was going to the hospital to clear the way for the ambulance and to pick up the chief's personal property." End quote. The previous report, as well as many others you will hear pieces of in this episode, were all obtained from the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. According to Johnston's report, he would arrive at the hospital at approximately 4:36 a.m., at which time he was met by an orderly who presented him with Chief Hamrick's pistol, holster, handcuffs, belt, and a ring of keys. At that time, the orderly reportedly told Johnston that the chief was in very serious condition. Nearly an hour later, at approximately 5:20 a.m., Patrolman Gary Martin arrived at the hospital, having gone and picked up Myrtle to rush her to be at her husband's side. In his report, Johnston states that upon their arrival, he handed the items the orderly had given him over to Gary Martin. Noting the serious nature of Chief Hamrick's injuries, doctors at Ashtabula General Hospital advised that Robert needed surgery and they were not equipped to handle it. At the time, the decision was made to transfer Hamrick via helicopter to the Cleveland Clinic, some 40 miles away. Johnston reported that the helicopter lifted off with Hamrick on board at 6:08 a.m., more than 4 hours after his last radio transmission. According to reports taken at the first hospital, Chief Hamrick was suffering from severe head and chest injuries. Upon arriving at the Cleveland Clinic, Chief Hamrick was quickly prepped and rushed into surgery. Dr. Moses Tagioff, at the time a neurosurgeon, assisted in the operation. Following the completion of brain surgery, Chief Hamrick was moved into recovery, though he remained in critical condition. Back in Ashtabula County, the Sheriff's Department were leading the investigation to determine what exactly had happened. Already, within hours of Chief Hamrick's accident, there were rumors circulating around town that this had been no mere accident. The rumor, which picked up the most steam, suggested that the chief had been goaded into pursuing a vehicle as he had many times before, but on this time, he had been purposefully led to Callender Road where some kind of an ambush was waiting for him. After forcing Hamrick off the road, the rumor went on to suggest that the chief had been pulled from his vehicle and severely beaten by members of the Rock Creek gang. After beating the chief about the head and chest, he was then placed back inside his cruiser. The ignition and police lights were turned off to make it more difficult to locate him, and the assailants drove off, leaving the chief for dead. Whether or not this rumor has any merit has been the subject of intense debate for more than 50 years. According to Corporal Johnston, after leaving the hospital, he returned to the Sheriff's Department where he spoke with the dispatcher, Deputy Dispenza. Inquiring about the vehicle Chief Hamrick was pursuing, Johnston reported that a check on the Rambler's license plate showed that the car was owned by a Joyce Harvey living in West Austinburg, approximately 10 miles north of Rock Creek. Johnston, along with Deputies Silva and Conceal, then went to Harvey's home but didn't find the car there. When questioned, Harvey explained that she had left her car at a Sunoco gas station to have the oil changed. The station was located in Austinburg at the intersection of State Route 45 and I-90. Johnston goes on to write that when they arrived at the station, they found the Rambler in bad shape. While Joyce Harvey had said the vehicle was in great condition when she last saw it, Johnston reported that one of the front tires was blown out and it appeared that the car had been driven hard. Upon arriving, Johnston found an employee working to repair the vehicle. Since this man's name has never been publicly released, I am going to refer to him by a pseudonym. Johnston identified the man as Victor Figure, an alleged member of the Rock Creek gang. Asked about the condition of the Rambler, Figure claimed that he'd found it that way when he'd arrived for work in the morning. Johnston asked Figure what he was driving, and the man gestured towards another Rambler parked alongside of the gas station. Approaching the vehicle, Johnston found the windows frosted over and the engine cold, which made him somewhat suspicious of Figure's story if he had just gotten to work a short time earlier. At the time, it seemed, the Sheriff's Department didn't want to question Victor Figure any further, though. Deputy Chapman, who had been the first man on the scene of Chief Hamrick's accident, completed a full report of what appeared to have happened. Chapman wrote that the accident had appeared to have occurred as the result of the road being icy and Chief Hamrick losing control of the vehicle. Chapman wrote, quote, "Skid marks in the gravel road with a layer of ice underneath indicate that the driver of the car lost control 155 feet east and 10 feet north of the point of impact. The tree was about 1 foot in diameter. I observed the car 3 feet to the east of the tree, which would indicate that the car ricocheted off the tree after impact." End quote. Going through the vehicle, after Chief Hamrick had been taken away by ambulance, Chapman listed the items he recovered as being a policeman's service cap, a tear gas nightstick, a book of uniform citations, a long nightstick, a commercial band radio, a citizen band radio, a black attaché case, and a flashlight emergency light with a red flasher. He described the vehicle as having a large quantity of blood in both the front and back seat. According to Chapman, he saw no footprints in the snow surrounding the vehicle, and as for the ignition and lights being turned off, he wrote that the vehicle's key was still in the ignition, though it was bent and appeared to have been turned to the off position. At the time, the Sheriff's Department reported that all available evidence indicated that Chief Hamrick's accident had been just that, having found no evidence of an ambush or foul play. On Friday, March 20th, after clinging to life for 9 long, difficult days, Chief Robert Hamrick tragically succumbed to his injuries and passed away. Dr. Moses Tagioff, who had been involved in Hamrick's surgery, was the one who would declare him dead. In his official report, Tagioff wrote that he suspected foul play had been involved in Chief Hamrick's death, and he requested that an autopsy be conducted. Dr. Charles Hirsch performed the autopsy the following day on Saturday, March 21st at 9 a.m. at the Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office. Dr. Hirsch wrote in his report that Chief Hamrick had suffered, quote, blunt impact to the head with lacerations and contusions of the head, contusions of the brain, extensive brain swelling and necrosis, status post-craniotomy, abrasions and contusions of legs and right hand, acute confluent bronchopneumonia bilateral, end quote. Writing out the cause of death, Dr. Hirsch reported, quote, blunt impact to head with contusions of brain and extensive brain swelling and necrosis. Auto fixed object accident driver, end quote. While investigating officers and the coroner had agreed that Chief Hamrick's death was the result of an accident, the persistence of rumors drove the sheriff's department to do a thorough investigation to ensure all data supported the accident theory. On Saturday, March 28th, Sheriff's Department Detective Moisio filed a report noting that he had interviewed a quote-unquote very good informant who identified Victor Figure as the driver of the Rambler that Chief Hamrick was pursuing. This informant, however, stated that while Figure had been the driver, he did not return to the accident scene to assault Chief Hamrick, nor was he aware of anyone who would have done so. Moisio's report goes on to state, quote, Patrolman Gary Martin stated that Chief Hamrick had attempted to stop Victor Figure earlier that evening, but could not catch him, end quote. On Monday, March 30th, Detective Moisio made his way over to the Republic Auto Parts lot at 445 Fairport Nursery Road in Paynesville to examine Chief Hamrick's wrecked cruiser. According to this report, no alterations had been made to the car outside of the removal of the radio equipment. Detective Moisio wrote, quote, the 1968 Dodge four-door sedan had severe damage to the left front portion. The front windshield is cracked, but there is no sign of contact with the deceased. The engine is driven back towards the firewall. The dashboard is driven forward and upward. The steering post is driven out several inches. The rearview mirror is covered with blood and hair, indicating the driver made contact. The left front door would not open. End quote. Keep that point about the door not opening in mind. We'll circle back to it later. Detective Moisio continued, quote, the patrol car had two types of sirens, standard and the new electronic type. The control unit for the electronic siren was mounted near the top and center of the dashboard. The unit was bent and covered with blood. The police radio was mounted in the center and underneath the dash, and a citizen band radio was mounted on the passenger side and under the glove compartment. The CB radio was damaged and covered with blood. The vehicle was also equipped with two large red flashing lights with electronic horn mounted on the roof. The control for these lights, a push-pull type switch, was mounted to the right of the steering wheel and ignition. Also mounted to the right of the steering wheel and ignition was the standard siren switch, toggle type. The car ignition switch was mounted low and to the right of the steering column. The key was broken off and part was still in the assembly. The key was bent and was broken when it was tried to be removed. The headlights and four-way flasher switches are mounted high and to the left of the steering wheel. They are the toggle type, up position for on and down for off. The toggle type headlight switch was not checked to see if it was in the on or off position. There was no electrical power due to the damaged battery. Due to the key being in a bent position, it was unable to be determined at the scene if the key was in an off position. The one push-pull type switch that was said to be in the off position at the scene of the accident was not the headlight switch, but the red flasher control, and it could very easily have been pushed in by the driver when striking the dashboard. End quote. Detective Moisio concluded his report, writing, quote, the information that was gathered during the investigation reveals that Chief Robert Hamrick did not meet with any foul play before or after the accident. All injuries that he sustained were the direct result of the accident. The accident investigation shows that the vehicle was traveling at a high rate of speed. the injury sustained was the result of the driver striking the steering wheel, rearview mirror, electronic siren control unit, citizen band radio, dashboard, and the front right door." End quote. Despite the continuing spread of rumors throughout Rock Creek that Chief Hamrick had been murdered after being forced off the road, the sheriff's department ruled that his death had been the result of a tragic automobile accident after he lost control during a high-speed pursuit. The Hamrick family strongly disagreed with this ruling, but regardless of their arguments, the case was officially closed. This is how everything would remain for the next 21 years, until Unsolved Mysteries made the decision to cover the case, asking several questions about the accident, the investigation, and the personal belongings of Chief Hamrick. In July of 1991, producers from Unsolved Mysteries arrived in Rock Creek to conduct interviews and to film reenactments of Chief Hamrick's death. Deputy Dennis Chapman, the first man on the scene of the accident, sat down for an interview with the Akron Beacon Journal to discuss the filming as well as his involvement in the segment. Chapman, who had retired from police work in 1978, reported being surprised that he was contacted by producers. While he noted the accident hadn't been eating away at him over the years, he also acknowledged that it was never far from his mind. Curiously, this is where we get somewhat of a conflict from Deputy Chapman. While both in this interview and on Unsolved Mysteries, he notes that he had heard Chief Hamrick's radio call and intended to back him up. The official reports from the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department state clearly that Deputy Chapman did not hear the original call, nor was he aware that Chief Hamrick had been involved in any pursuit that night, saying that he only became aware of an issue when Deputy Dispenza contacted him and directed him to Callender Road to look for Hamrick. Deputy Chapman, however, would not be the only former investigator whose statement showed some inconsistencies. Following the release of the episode, the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department was driven to take another look at the case and to conduct a new investigation to, hopefully, dismiss any rumors and speculation that had built up over the years and had been fanned on by the show. One of the first people they sought to speak with was their own boss. By 1991, the second man to arrive at the scene, Corporal William Johnston, had moved up in the ranks and was now the sheriff of Ashtabula County. Asked his thoughts about the accident, Johnston told Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "I still don't believe to this day that all the injuries that Bob received were the result of that car accident." End quote. This is certainly a compelling statement from the man in charge, and he believes that this was more than an accident. Any fervor generated by this admission, though, was quickly dismissed. In an interview conducted by a sheriff's deputy following the airing of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, Sheriff Johnston appears to have changed his tune. The report reads, quote, "Sheriff Johnston explained that upon his arrival at the crash site, there was nothing that indicated to him that this was anything else but a traffic accident and was treated as such. After Hamrick died, Johnston remembers rumors circulating around Rock Creek that the injuries received by the chief were inflicted on him by unknown persons. Rumors ran rampant that Chief Hamrick's death was covered up by then-Sheriff Tom Fasula. Johnston said he personally never saw any evidence to substantiate these rumors. Johnston further stated that he is aware that the Hamrick family has used the news media, including the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, to further attempt to substantiate these rumors. Sheriff Johnston says that at no time was he a part of a Hamrick death cover-up, nor does he have any knowledge of any cover-up by the late Sheriff Tom Fasula, nor does he suspect anything." End quote. So, are you wondering what I am? If Sheriff Johnston doesn't believe this was anything more than an accident, why tell Unsolved Mysteries the exact opposite, and then act like it's the family stirring up rumors when he in fact is the one who said he didn't believe it was just an accident? Let's take this a step further. Remember how when Johnston arrived at the Sunoco station, he questioned Victor Figure and found his answers to be somewhat questionable? It's strange that no follow-up interviews were ever conducted, especially when Sheriff Johnston then goes on to tell Unsolved Mysteries that he knew Victor Figure and, quote, "Knowing that he hung around Rock Creek area and that I had trouble with him in the past, I felt that he was directly involved." End quote. So, which way is it? Was this just an accident, or was something more going on, and possibly Victor Figure was a part of it? I suppose it all depends on what day you ask him that question. Following along with the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department report SO 70-1030, the investigator notes that he followed up on multiple calls that Unsolved Mysteries received following the airing of the Hamrick episode. The report reads, quote, "None of these callers could give any pertinent information that would assist us in this investigation. Each of these callers stated they heard from a third or fourth party that Hamrick was killed by Jerry Hooks." End quote. As with Victor Figure, Jerry Hooks is also a pseudonym I've chosen to protect this person's privacy, as he has never been named a suspect either. I should note at this time, while former Sheriff Tom Fasula's name has come up as possibly being involved in a cover-up of Chief Hamrick's death, it has been reported that Jerry Hooks was in fact related to Sheriff Fasula. One caller, identified as a woman in Florida, told the investigator that she had heard that Jerry Hooks had jumped into the roadway during the high-speed pursuit, causing Chief Hamrick to swerve out of control, striking the tree. This is very interesting, as a woman, under the cover of anonymity, was involved in the Unsolved Mysteries episode as well, where she stated that she'd heard a group of local Rock Creek men saying, quote, "We killed us a cop and we got away with it." And then they proceeded to tell how they killed him and how they beat him in the head. They had planned it all. They set him up, getting him down there on this dirt road, and they took his billy club and they started hitting him. They put him back into his car, and then they left him there, left him to die. I knew in my heart they would never get caught. End quote. Despite what possible leads this might be able to generate, the investigating officer concludes his section on these calls by writing, quote, "These types of calls were welcomed, but time-consuming, and not one caller could give any information vital to the investigation. It is apparent that the discrepancies portrayed on Unsolved Mysteries, compared to the facts of this case, just added to the rumors and finger-pointing and inconsistencies. The phone calls made as a result of the TV show were of no value to this investigation." End quote. On November 26, 1991, Chief Hopkins of the Rock Creek Police Department was interviewed regarding his own investigation into Chief Hamrick's death. Chief Hopkins, in an interview with the media, had previously reported that he was in possession of vital information which could lead to arrests of those involved in Chief Hamrick's death. The official interview states, quote, "Chief Hopkins stated that he was given vital information about the Hamrick death by 2 confidential informants. Chief Hopkins went on to say these 2 confidential informants would not talk with the sheriff's detectives as they mistrusted them. Chief Hopkins stated that he believes as a result of this information, there was no doubt in his mind that there was a conspiracy to get Chief Hamrick, and the car chase was part of this conspiracy." End quote. While Chief Hopkins made it clear that he was conducting his own investigation into the case, the Sheriff's Department reminded him that they possessed jurisdiction over the investigation, and according to the report, quote, "Although Chief Hopkins promised cooperation, it was apparent he would not do so." End quote. In a follow-up interview with Chief Hopkins, which occurred several days later on December 2nd, he revealed the names of his 2 suspects in this case. The report says, quote, "Hopkins advised me he had spoken to Victor Figure, who had admitted he was driving the car Hamrick was chasing. Chief Hopkins could not offer any other information. We did discuss Jerry Hooks as a suspect. Chief Hopkins related to me that he is in contact with a female who is willing to testify that she overheard Jerry Hooks and another unknown subject state that he, Jerry Hooks, is the person responsible for the Hamrick death. Chief Hopkins would not reveal the name of this female. Chief Hopkins said this female will come forward only if this case comes to court." End quote. On that same date of December 2nd, an interview was also conducted with Jerry Hooks. The report notes that in almost all of the tips called in and rumors circulating around town, Jerry Hooks was always mentioned as being involved in Chief Hamrick's death. The report states, quote, "It should be noted that at the time of the Hamrick incident, Jerry Hooks was known by most police officers in Ashtabula County as a combative person and town tough. End quote. Hooks admitted to being a town tough and having his run-ins with the law. Hooks also stated that it was Victor Figure and his brother, Kirk, who were being pursued by Chief Hamrick the night of the accident. The report goes on to say, quote, Hooks is sure they would never go back to hurt Hamrick after the crash. End quote. Asked about the night of the accident, the report states, quote, Hooks stated that as best he could recollect, he was home with his now ex-wife. Hooks went on to say that he knew Hamrick, but never threatened him. Hooks was asked if he ever called Hamrick's house, and Hooks denied he ever did. Hooks vehemently denied that he was ever a part of or knew of a conspiracy to get Hamrick. Hooks stated most of his run-ins with Hamrick were over traffic. Hooks explained that he and Hamrick had a sort of thing between them and would laugh at each other and wave when they pulled alongside one another in their vehicles. Hooks said a lot of times Hamrick would kiddingly tell Hooks that he, Hamrick, was going to arrest him. Hooks reiterated that he never heard of a conspiracy to get Hamrick, nor was he part of one. End quote. Following this interview, Hooks agreed to take a polygraph test. According to the report, he passed this test and was specifically asked if he was home when the incident occurred, if he had hit or assaulted Chief Hamrick, if he knew of anyone who had assaulted Chief Hamrick, and if he was involved in a conspiracy to harm Chief Hamrick. The following day, on December 3rd, the investigator arrived to conduct an interview with Victor Figure, the first official interview he had regarding Chief Hamrick's death since the day it happened more than 21 years earlier. According to Figure, he was working at the Sunoco station in Austinburg at the time, and he was opening and closing the station because his boss was out sick. On Tuesday, March 10th, 1970, he had been working to repair the carburetor of Joyce Harvey's Rambler, and after closing, he decided to take the car for a test drive, which, according to him, was not uncommon. Figure then explained that he drove by his mother's home in Austinburg and picked up his brother, Kirk. The two then proceeded towards Rock Creek. Asked what time he got off work, Figure thought it had likely been around 10 p.m. Asked if he and his brother had stopped at any local bars, Figure couldn't recall. According to Figure, he and his brother were driving down East Water Street before turning south onto Route 45. At this point, he explains, quote, I was being followed by Chief Hamrick, who had no lights on his car. He followed me for a couple of minutes. The thought had gone through my head that he had been in a chase a short time before this and shot Nathan Chuck while in pursuit. That thought, plus no lights on, I panicked and headed out of town south on Route 45. In a few seconds, he then had all of his lights on in pursuit of me. At some point, I saw he was right on my bumper and began slowing down to stop. I was just near stop, just a few feet short of Callender Road. He passed me at a high rate of speed. End quote. After Chief Hamrick passed, Figure stated that he turned onto Callender Road and began heading west. Moments later, he saw lights approaching from behind, though he couldn't recall if he saw police lights. After passing through the double S curve, he never saw the lights behind him again. When asked why he believed the chief had passed him, Figure replied that maybe he didn't realize they were the car he was pursuing. So, just to summarize, according to Victor Figure, Chief Hamrick was pursuing him with his lights off, so he speeds up to try and get away. Then, Chief Hamrick turns on his lights and sirens and continues the pursuit, so close that he's nearly on Figure's bumper. At that point, Figure slows down and stops, and Chief Hamrick speeds right by him because the car, who he is following that closely, has somehow managed to confuse him and he's not sure it's the right car anymore? Does that make any sense to you? Also, keep in mind that Chief Hamrick radioed in the license plate number of the car he was following, SR775, so how exactly did he get confused? If this makes no sense to you, trust me, I'm right there with you. Following the conclusion of this interview, Victor Figure agreed to take a polygraph test. According to the Sheriff's Department report, both Victor and his brother Kirk passed their tests. 8 days later, on December 11th, Chief Hopkins was once again contacted. According to the report, quote, At this time, Chief Hopkins voiced his resentment because I had Victor Figure polygraphed. End quote. The report then reiterates that the investigator reminded Chief Hopkins again that this is their investigation and not his. According to original reports from 1970, Chief A.A. Cedar of the Jefferson Police Department had noted several curious details about the scene of the accident. In his report, Cedar wrote, quote, I did hear Deputy Chapman and Corporal Johnston refer to the fact that all electrical switches within the wrecked cruiser, A5, had been found in the off position. Also, reference was made to a large amount of blood observed on the ground outside of the cruiser and some distance, several feet, from the driver's door. Photos taken later disclosed that this door had been jammed and could not easily be opened. It was outside of this door that the pool of blood was reported. End quote. I told you we'd make our way back to this jammed door, so I assume you're wondering why this is an important detail. Chief Cedar reports that there was a large amount of blood on the ground outside of the cruiser a few feet away from the jammed driver's side door. Well, when Deputy Chapman was interviewed by investigators on December 4th, 1991, he reported that in order to keep Chief Hamrick comfortable at the scene, he had covered him with a blanket. When the chief was removed from the vehicle and loaded onto the ambulance, this blanket fell to the ground and deposited a large amount of blood on the ground outside of the jammed door. I suppose the most rational question to ask here is, how did that blanket end up outside of the door that couldn't be opened? Unless EMTs decided to pull Hamrick out through the window rather than opening the passenger door, this just doesn't make any sense. In addition, Deputy Chapman's own initial report of the accident makes no note of blood on the ground, nor does it seem logical that a blanket placed on the chief would be enough to create what has been described as a puddle of blood simply by falling to the ground. Returning to Chief Cedar's report, he made an interesting note. Cedar wrote that when Chief Hamrick arrived at the Cleveland Clinic, one of the doctors working on him asked, "What hit this man?" Cedar notes that this question, formed in this way, may in and of itself be the origin for many of the rumors about Chief Hamrick being assaulted. Of course, there is no actual follow-up in the investigation to find out why this question was asked, since you'd imagine the surgeons would have been notified in advance that they were going to be conducting surgery on a car accident victim who was being flown in via helicopter, but maybe that question's just one too many to ask. Cedar's report also makes reference to Victor Figure, specifically to his actions in the hours following Chief Hamrick's accident. Cedar writes, quote, "The subject appeared in a Rock Creek tavern with blood on his shoes. The subject was reported to have frequented the same bar in Rock Creek later that morning after opening for business and appeared very shaken, and in conversation with another male, mentioned wanting to tell something to the authorities. At that time, he was advised and then threatened by the other subject regarding such action." End quote. So, Victor Figure, the man who Chief Hamrick was pursuing that night, shows up at a bar the next morning with blood on his shoes and tells someone that he needs to tell the police something, at which time that person tells him to keep his mouth shut. And this was not followed up on at the time for reasons. Now we arrive at one of the most controversial aspects of this case: Robert Hamrick's service revolver and gun belt. According to Sheriff Johnston, upon arriving at the hospital on the morning of March 11th, 1970, he was handed several items which had been on Chief Hamrick. This included his belt and service revolver. Johnston reports that when Patrolman Gary Martin arrived with Myrtle Hamrick, that Johnston handed these items over to Martin. Martin later tells investigators, quote, "The equipment I had was taken and cleaned up. It was then returned to the family. The holster that Chief Hamrick was using belonged to Jack Pope, and this was returned to him." Martin remembered being given Chief Hamrick's gun belt, including the service revolver. Martin stated that he thought he was given 2 pistols that morning, Hamrick's service revolver and a snub-nosed pistol Martin said Hamrick carried as an extra weapon. Martin remembered receiving these weapons, but was vague on what he did with them. He thinks he gave the service revolver to Chief Hamrick's brother Gilbert and the snub-nose to then Mayor Schlecht. End quote. On December 19th, 1991, investigators conducted an interview with Robert's brother Gilbert. Gilbert had conducted his own investigation into his brother's death, though most of his files were destroyed when his home was burglarized years earlier. The report goes on to state, quote, "All he could remember is that his investigation revealed that his brother often carried a 10-cell flashlight. This was missing. Gilbert said Robert kept a snub-nosed .38 in the glove box, and this was also missing. Gilbert thinks Robert's gun belt, service revolver, and holster was given to Gary Martin, who in turn gave it to Robert's father, Forrest, now deceased. Gilbert thinks his father, Forrest, later gave this equipment, including the service revolver, to Myrtle Hamrick. He feels his brother was hit on the head with his, Chief Hamrick's, flashlight. He also stated that Bob had told him that he had fired Gary Martin. This conversation was supposed to have taken place a few days prior to the accident. Gilbert also said that he knew Bob carried a .38 special on him, plus the snub nose in the glove compartment. Gilbert hasn't seen any of these guns after the accident. Gilbert stated he thought Tom Fasula's nephew, Jerry Hooks, was one of the suspects, and the other was Gary Martin." End quote. Why exactly Gilbert believed that Gary Martin, a patrolman working for his brother, was involved in his death is never explained or expanded upon in these reports. In a subsequent interview conducted with former Mayor David Schlecht, he was directly asked about whether or not Gary Martin had given him one of Chief Hamrick's guns, as he claimed. The report states, quote, "Mr. Schlecht also said that after Chief Hamrick died, he could not give a date. Gary Martin came to his house and gave him a snub-nosed pistol that Gary Martin said was Hamrick's at the time of the accident. Mr. Schlecht said that Gary Martin was working as a police auxiliary with the Rock Creek Police Department and had not been fired prior to Hamrick's accident. Mr. Schlecht stated after Chief Hamrick's funeral, he gave the snub-nosed pistol to Gilbert Hamrick, who had visited Mr. Schlecht and asked for this pistol." End quote. This, of course, is confusing, as Gilbert himself claimed that he never received any of the guns his brother is alleged to have carried. To complicate matters even further, Robert's son, Chris, alongside his mother, Myrtle, had apparently asked Sheriff Johnston why they never received Chief Hamrick's service revolver. At that point, Johnston explained that he turned all of the chief's possessions over to Gary Martin at the hospital the morning of the accident. Chris then asked the sheriff why Gary Martin had not been charged with theft, as his family never received any of Robert's guns or his gun belt. Bizarrely, in March of 1992, Myrtle Hamrick filed a police report in which she stated that her home had been burglarized. Among the items listed as stolen in a report dated March 18, 1992, are a black leather attaché case containing Chief Hamrick's gun belt and handcuff case, a .25 caliber automatic pistol, a gold watch, a jewelry box, keys to the police cruiser, handcuffs, billy club, police handbook, shoulder holster for a .38 caliber handgun, miscellaneous papers including Chief Hamrick's death certificate, and 2 rings. Chris Hamrick, according to the Sheriff's Department report, stated that whoever had broken into his mother's home had chosen only these particular items connected to his father, and that the thief had taken the time to lay out personal photographs and papers on a bed, taking only specific ones. The investigator writing the report was confused, noting that Chris and Myrtle had previously claimed they'd never received Robert's gun or gun belt, yet now the gun belt was being listed as one of the items stolen. On March 20th, 1992, exactly 22 years to the day that Chief Robert Hamrick died, the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department contacted Chris Hamrick in an attempt to track down Robert's service revolver. Reportedly, Chris told the investigator that his older brother Kenneth was in possession of the revolver. The investigator sought contact information for Kenneth in order to verify the serial number, but writes in his report that Chris refused to give him Kenneth's contact information. Unsolved Mysteries reported that Chief Hamrick's service revolver was never recovered. Apparently, there were possibly 2 other handguns either on Chief Hamrick or in his vehicle the night of the accident. One gun was reportedly given to the mayor, who then claims he turned it over to Gilbert, though Gilbert says he never received it. The family allegedly reported that they'd never received Chief Hamrick's gun belt or guns, but then report the gun belt stolen and claim that Kenneth is in possession of the service revolver. As you can see, there are a lot of reasons why this case has become as confusing and convoluted as it is, but we're not quite through it yet. In February of 1992, investigators contacted Dr. Moses Tagioff, who had been involved in Robert's surgery and who had ultimately declared him dead. Since it was noted that, upon Robert's death, Dr. Tagioff had written that he suspected foul play, investigators wanted to know why this was. Dr. Tagioff could not recall making that notation. The report on this interview continues, quote, Dr. Tagioff explained, although he does not specifically remember this particular case, in studying Hamrick's medical records, Dr. Tagioff could find no reason for him to suspect foul play. Dr. Tagioff further advised me that had he in fact found any indication of foul play, he would have noted this in Hamrick's medical file. Dr. Tagioff commented he had seen the notation on the coroner's office intake for Dr. Tagioff suspects foul play. He stated he does not know how or why this was written. End quote. Dr. Tagioff later examined Chief Hamrick's autopsy report and sent a letter to the sheriff's department noting that he saw nothing in the report to suggest foul play, and that if any indications of foul play had been found, then Dr. Hirsch, who had performed the autopsy, surely would have noted it in his own report. On March 16th, the sheriff's department got into contact with an employee of the Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office who had performed Chief Hamrick's autopsy. This employee stated that oftentimes in the 1970s, notations on reports suggesting autopsies for foul play were written by the intake clerks, and that these notations were based on nothing more than the clerk's own opinion. Not long after this interview, sheriff's investigators got into contact with Dr. Hirsch, who by the early 1990s was working as the chief medical examiner of New York City. Asked to review the autopsy he had conducted on Chief Hamrick 20 years earlier, Dr. Hirsch explained, quote, that there were no injuries on the body at all that would suggest any assault with a blunt instrument, such as a flashlight or a nightstick. Also, he stated that the autopsy did not disclose any evidence of multiple, discrete, or separate impacts to his face and head. Dr. Hirsch stated that Robert Hamrick died as the result of a severe head injury resulting from a forceful impact to the left side of his face and head. He stated that all of the findings were consistent with causation of his injury by an auto collision, and none were inconsistent with causation by an auto collision. End quote. 1 month later, in April of 1992, the Ohio Highway Patrol completed a full report reconstructing Chief Hamrick's accident. The report explained, quote, at the time of the collision, Chief Hamrick was not using a seatbelt. At first contact with the tree, the left side of the car is decelerating and starting to rotate. Chief Hamrick is still moving toward the tree at the cruiser's pre-impact speed. The bench seat of the car is smooth. This allows the car to rotate left with little if any resistance or adhesion to keep Chief Hamrick behind the steering wheel. Additionally, the rear of the cruiser is rising as the front is being forced down. The cruiser essentially rotates out from under Chief Hamrick. As deceleration continues and the rear of the cruiser is rising, Chief Hamrick strikes the center dash area with the left side of his head. The steering wheel is moved backward from impact, and the left front seat appears to have moved forward. At this point, Chief Hamrick was no longer behind the steering wheel. Photographs indicate Chief Hamrick most likely struck the PA control unit mounted on the dashboard near the glove box with his head. Descriptions of his injuries contained within the autopsy report were consistent with the control unit configuration. End quote. Upon completion of their reinvestigation, the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department reaffirmed their original ruling that Chief Robert Hamrick's death came directly as the result of his vehicle sliding out of control and slamming into a tree just outside of the double S curve along Callender Road. Following completion of their report, Sheriff Johnston handed all files over to John Leonard, director of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Leonard then assigned the case to Special Investigations, where it was re-examined by Thomas Almay in April of 1992. 2 months later in June, John Leonard was contacted by a reporter for the Daily Jeffersonian who inquired as to the results of the BCI's review of the Sheriff's Department's second investigation. Leonard explained, quote, "After 22 years, there are always going to be conflicting reports, and we'll never know for sure. But based on the preponderance of evidence, there is no reason to believe that Chief Hamrick died of anything other than an accident." End quote. So mystery solved, right? It seems based on the statements of investigators, doctors, accident reconstructionists, witnesses, and people who were present at the scene that Chief Robert Hamrick's death, while tragic and heart-wrenching, was not as a result of a conspiracy. Chief Hamrick hadn't been specifically targeted, forced off the road, assaulted and left for dead, leading to a cover-up which involved investigators and possibly even the former Sheriff Tom Fasola. Well, if it was that black and white, do you really believe I'd be covering this case? Here comes the biggest, most confusing twist in this entire investigation, and it comes from a fairly empirical source: the Ohio State Attorney General's office. While both the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation ruled that Chief Robert Hamrick's death occurred as the result of an automobile accident, the Ohio State Attorney General's office's website lists Chief Hamrick's case as an unsolved homicide. The website summarizes the case as follows, quote, "On the evening of March 10th, 1970, Chief Hamrick became involved in a pursuit of unknown individuals. The pursuit ended on Callender Road in the village of Rock Creek when Chief Hamrick slid off the icy dirt road and struck a tree, causing moderate damage to his vehicle. The events that unfolded immediately following the accident are unknown at this time. At some point, Chief Hamrick exited his patrol vehicle and was beaten severely on the side of his head with a tire iron. Somehow, his unconscious body was placed across the seat of his marked police vehicle. He was not discovered for hours and was transported to the Cleveland clinic where he died 10 days later, never regaining consciousness. The suspects are unknown at this time." End quote. I reached out both to the Attorney General's office as well as the Sheriff's Department for clarification about this. While the Sheriff's Department directed me to an investigator for whom I left several messages, they never got back to me either by telephone or email. On the other hand, I did manage to speak with someone at the Attorney General's office, but the answer wasn't what I was looking for. They explained to me that they could not reveal any details about the case, nor could they explain to me why they consider this to be an unsolved homicide. Their website lists details that I've not come across in the sheriff's investigative report nor in any media sources. At no time did I find anything about Chief Hamrick exiting his vehicle and being beaten with a tire iron. Here's the thing about this. This isn't a random website. This isn't the Sheriff's Department or a Crime Stoppers listing. This is written by someone at the Attorney General's office, someone who knows legally what they can and cannot say. If they did not have some factual basis, some evidence, some witness who has given them these details about the tire iron, I'd wager to bet there's no way they'd list this case as an unsolved homicide when two separate departments inside their own jurisdiction have both ruled it closed, accidental, and with no foul play. So what does that tell you? There's a hell of a lot more going on here than we may ever know about. At the heart of this matter is the death of a 29-year-old chief of police, and more than 50 years later, the truth has still not been revealed. The Rock Creek Police Department was closed more than 20 years after Robert's death. Many have argued that the move to shut down the force was done not over money, not over a lack of need, but because people kept digging into Robert's case and wouldn't let it get swept under the rug. Once again, this case comes back to the same difficult problems. A lot of speculation, a ton of rumors, and no solid answers. Chief Robert Hamrick's police cruiser slammed into a tree along the western end of Callender Road in the early morning hours of Wednesday, March 11, 1970. 9 days later, Chief Hamrick passed away as a result of his injuries. He never regained consciousness. Robert Hamrick left behind two siblings, a father, his wife Myrtle, and his 3 beloved children, who at the time were 6, 2, and 8 months old. Robert's funeral was held in Madison, and he was laid to rest in Madison Cemetery on March 24th, following a funeral procession which passed through Rock Creek. On April 22, 1987, Chief Robert Hamrick was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor from the American Police Hall of Fame. Just what exactly happened that cold, dark, early morning in 1970 remains the source of great mystery for those who knew Robert and extreme pain for those who loved him. When Unsolved Mysteries ran their segment on Chief Hamrick, they asked his daughter, Brenda Sue, about her father's death. She replied, quote, "There is evidence, and people just have ignored that evidence. And they've ignored the circumstances at the time and what was going on in the village at the time. I just hope that we find out what actually happened, and if we find out who's responsible, that they pay for what they did. They took my father from me, and I think it's time they got something taken from them." The first time I'd ever heard about the death of Chief Robert Hamrick was back when Unsolved Mysteries aired their original episode in 1991. Now, at the time, I was 9 years old and couldn't quite grasp what exactly had happened, but it was a case that's always stuck with me. Here, you have a chief of police essentially under siege. He's being threatened and harassed by a group of people who are running all manner of illegal activities through the small village of Rock Creek. Then one night, Chief Hamrick is severely injured in a car accident, or was it more than that? Despite multiple witnesses coming forward and directly naming people who may have been involved in causing the chief's accident and then beating him, nothing's really done about it. During the original investigation, leads which you think would be followed up on are basically ignored. Corporal Johnston thinks Victor Figure is lying, but doesn't press him any further. Jerry Hooks is named by multiple people as being involved, but he's not questioned. Usually, when a police officer is killed in the line of duty, even if it's from an accident, investigators pull out all the stops to make sure they get every detail right. That doesn't happen here, and it seems rather apparent that the decision was made that this was a car accident and only a car accident, regardless of what other information might become available. Several years ago, I sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department, and the response I got was surprising. Normally, when I send out one of these requests, I get a letter in return that either denies my requests or tells me how much money I have to pay for those reports. It all depends on the department and how many pages of reports there are. Neither of those things happened here. After sending out my FOIA request, I checked it off my list and went back about my business. I got a call from the local post office a few days later that a package was there for me at my P.O. box. Not knowing what it could be, I went down there and was shocked to find a large box containing more than 100 pages of reports. This package included original reports from 1970, as well as the reinvestigation in 91 and 92. In addition to the police reports, I was also supplied with all the medical examiner reports. This is the first time and only time in my 5 years of working for Trace Evidence that a department has just sent me files without asking for money or notifying me in advance that they were going to be sending them. Part of me felt like I got lucky. Part of me wondered if someone in that department wanted me to take a look. Either way, I began digging into the files, finding them horribly out of order. It took a while to put it all together, and from there I was able to begin making connections. What stood out most to me was what I can only describe as the tone of those reports. They were written in such a way where it feels like any person and any evidence which supports the accident theory is considered undeniable, while any people or evidence that provides possible alternate theories were considered untrustworthy and unworthy of the time it takes to track leads down. Maybe that's just me, but these reports had a lot of dismissive language, and it's quite clear that whoever wrote them was not a fan of Unsolved Mysteries at all. Which is kind of funny because the sheriff's department cooperated with the production and the sheriff himself was interviewed. So obviously this is a highly complex case, and it's certainly not one where I could go through all of the different possibilities without needing countless hours to examine each and every detail. I think at the end of the day, the primary question that needs to be answered is clear. did Robert Hamrick lose control of his vehicle while pursuing Victor Figure, causing him to slide off the road and collide with a tree in an accident where he sustained such severe head and chest injuries that he could not recover? Or is it possible that Chief Hamrick was goaded into following Figure, who drove him down Callender Road into an ambush, where he was forced from the road, pulled from his vehicle, and beaten with a blunt object, perhaps a tire iron, as the state's Attorney General's office has suggested? So, let's begin with statements from investigators. If indeed this was merely a car accident with nothing else involved, why do we have people talking out of both sides of their mouths? Sheriff Johnston goes on national television and says he doesn't believe this is just an accident and Victor Figure was involved. Then in reports from his own department, he says the opposite, that it was always just an accident, and he never saw any reason to think differently. Was the sheriff just needlessly speculating for reasons unknown? Wouldn't make a whole lot of sense since, as sheriff, all it's going to do is create more grief for him and his own investigators. Former Deputy Dennis Chapman says that he heard Chief Hamrick's call about the high-speed pursuit and intended to join him. Then, when talking to investigators, the report states that he never heard the initial calls and only became aware of any issues with the chief when the dispatcher, Deputy Dispenza, asked him to go out to Callender Road and search for him. Why the two different stories? Again, this is one of those situations where I can't quite understand why you'd lie about it one way or the other. You've got Chief A.A. Cedar on the one hand saying that he's got an informant that claims Victor Figure was at the bar the morning after the accident with blood on his shoes, talking about how he needed to tell the police something. Someone threatens him, and from that point forward, it doesn't really go anywhere. Then Cedar writes, it seemed clear to him that this was just a tragic accident and nothing more. Being that apparently no one followed up on the information about Victor Figure, I guess you'd have to believe it was purely accidental, wouldn't you? Moving on to the scene of the crime, that in and of itself provides a lot of questions. The driver's side door of the cruiser is damaged to the point that it can't be opened, yet when Chief Cedar mentions a puddle of blood a few feet outside of this door, Deputy Chapman says it's from a blanket falling onto the ground when they pulled Hamrick out of the vehicle and loaded him onto an ambulance. So again, I asked, did they pull him out the window rather than just opening the passenger side door? I also think it's worth noting that according to the accident reconstruction and the autopsy report, it's theorized that Chief Hamrick, upon hitting the tree, was thrown first into the dash and then towards the passenger side door, striking his head on the radio unit mounted beneath the glove box. So, if Chief Hamrick is lying across the bench seat with his head either close to or in direct contact with the passenger door, why would you do anything through the driver's side window? I also find it hard to believe that laying a blanket on the chief while you wait for an ambulance and then dropping that blanket on the ground would be enough to create what Cedar described as a puddle of blood several feet from the door. It's also worth noting that neither in his accident report nor in Johnston's report, being the second man on the scene, is there any mention of blood on the ground or a blanket being involved at all. Deputy Chapman actually went so far in his report to note that there were no footsteps in the snow around the vehicle, so it's unlikely that anyone else was at the scene to pull Hamrick out and assault him. If upon arriving at the scene, Chapman immediately knew this was just a tragic car accident, why did it even occur to him to examine the snow for footprints? He couldn't have done this after the ambulance arrived, as there would obviously be footprints from EMTs, himself, and Johnston. Just consider, Chapman is able to tell you exactly how many feet from the point of impact it was that Hamrick lost control of his vehicle, but he doesn't mention the blood or the blanket until he's asked about it 21 years later. Looking at the vehicle itself, hey, I'm no automotive expert. I couldn't tell you just how much damage a 1968 Dodge would take if it were to slide off the road and hit a tree at a high rate of speed. Also, just a quick note, how come there's never any mention of an estimated speed? You'd think that would be part of determining how the accident happened. Anyway, why is there this massive discrepancy between the state's attorney general's office and the sheriff's department about the damage to the vehicle? The car is described in the sheriff's department reports as being totaled, while the AG's office says the vehicle sustained moderate damage. There's quite a gap between what I would consider moderate damage and a totaled vehicle. According to the autopsy report combined with the accident reconstruction, it stated that at the moment of impact, Robert Hamrick was thrown across the front seat of the vehicle, striking his head on the radio, which is what ultimately caused the massive damage to his head. However, There's blood on several other pieces of equipment in the car, as well as blood and hair being found on the rearview mirror, but these are not addressed in either report. Beyond that, reports from the scene state that there was a large quantity of blood both in the front and back seat. If Chief Hamrick never left the front seat, how did so much blood get into the rear? Now, this next part is mostly just my own curiosity, but if it was a cold, icy morning and Chief Hamrick were speeding down Callender Road in pursuit of Victor Figure, who was driving a 1968 Rambler, just how fast was he going when he passed through the double S curve? Looking at the curve, this isn't something that you can just easily maneuver through under the best weather conditions. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me that Chief Hamrick, who knew the area and knew that road, would have entered the curves at such a high rate of speed. Staying on the subject of speed, Victor Figure tells investigators that he was trying to evade Chief Hamrick because he was afraid the chief might shoot him through his rear window as he had done to someone else during a previous pursuit. However, when Hamrick turns on his sirens, Figure described his cruiser as being almost on his bumper. So he pulls over, and Chief Hamrick speeds by him. Asked about this, Victor says that maybe the chief had gotten confused and didn't realize that was the same car he'd been chasing. Couple of problems with this. If he's nearly on your bumper, I'm not sure how he manages to get confused to the point of thinking he's looking for an entirely different car. Factor in that Hamrick radioed in the license plate number and that he knew Victor Figure by sight. I can't imagine there were a lot of other Ramblers with an SR775 license plate speeding down the road in front of Hamrick that night. In Victor's brother's statement to investigators, he noted that there may have been a 1967 or 68 Chevy Super Sport with loud exhaust driving in front of them on the road, and he thought that Chief Hamrick had confused the two cars and sped past them thinking the Chevy was his target. Do yourself a favor. Google image search a 1968 Rambler and a 1968 Chevy Super Sport and tell me how easy it would be to confuse these two cars, especially when you already know the license plate number of the car you're following so closely that you're almost on its bumper. For me, Victor Figure's account of that night is either absent of all the details or some of the information has been changed. According to Victor, he was taking the Rambler out for a test drive after repairing the carburetor, something which the owner, Joyce Harvey, never mentions as needing to be done. She dropped it off for an oil change. Now, maybe a test drive is needed to ensure everything is working right, but that doesn't mean you need to go, pick up your brother, and cruise around for hours. Victor said he left work at approximately 10 p.m. Chief Hamrick calls in his pursuit at 1:50 a.m. That's nearly 4 hours later. That's one hell of a test drive. This, in and of itself, changes the entire complexion of the incident. Was Chief Hamrick pursuing a vehicle he noticed driving erratically, possibly due to a drunk driver? Victor can't remember if he went to any bars that night. Or did he spot and recognize Victor behind the wheel of a car that he knew for a fact he did not own? According to Victor, after Chief Hamrick speeds past him, he turns onto Callender Road. As he was heading through the double S curve, he spotted lights behind him, though again, he couldn't remember well enough if he saw police sirens or not. This location is approximately 2 miles west on Callender Road after you turn off State Route 45. So now, I'm supposed to believe that after being confused and passing the car, Chief Hamrick turns around and gets on the Callender Road to pursue them again, but by the time he makes it there, they've already traveled about 2 miles? That is made especially strange when we know that Hamrick radioed in his pursuit at 1:50 and his turn onto Callender Road at 1:51. Seemingly, in the 1 minute between calls, Victor drove 2 miles down a dirt and gravel road that was so icy Chief Hamrick lost control of his police cruiser on it. Also, if indeed Chief Hamrick recognized Victor Figure, why would he need to be in the high-speed chase at all if it was so dangerous? He knows his name, he knows where he lives, where he works, and where he hangs out. Gary Martin allegedly said that Chief Hamrick tried to catch Victor earlier in the night, but couldn't. That seems strange, since Victor acknowledged the entire reason he pulled over that night was because the Rambler he was driving didn't have the power to outrun Chief Hamrick's 1968 Dodge. Like so much else in this case, almost nothing makes sense. From the contradictory statements of investigators to the obvious holes in Victor Figure's statements. Now, I do think it's worth noting that Figure, as well as Jerry Hooks, passed polygraph tests that were administered to them. I also think it's worth pointing out that I consider polygraph tests to be about as reliable as asking a psychic what they think happened. Tests can be beaten, questions can be asked wrong, whether it's a pass or fail, I just don't rely much on them at all. Jerry Hooks is mentioned by almost every person who contacts authorities and unsolved mysteries, but his alibi of being home with his then wife is never challenged nor put under intense pressure. When his ex-wife was asked about that night, she said she was sure Hooks was home, and she remembered a friend coming by to tell them what had happened. She describes this statement as kind of a celebratory one. For a guy who claims he had no ill will towards Hamrick, it's odd that Jerry Hooks found news of his accident to be a positive thing. Looking at the apparently missing guns, I've got to be honest with you, this is a rabbit hole, and it's a thing of chaos and confusion. First, there's the question of how many guns Hamrick had on him. We know his service revolver was there. He apparently also carried a .38 in a shoulder holster, and according to his brother, there should have been another gun in the glove box or elsewhere in the car. The service revolver either vanished or is in the possession of Hamrick's oldest son. The .38 was either given to the mayor and then to Hamrick's brother, or it was lost somewhere in the middle. While the mayor says he gave it to Gilbert, Gilbert says he's never gotten any of his brother's guns. Also, why would Patrolman Martin take one of Hamrick's guns and give it to the mayor rather than handing it over to his widow with all of his other equipment? It's not even his service revolver that was issued to him. It's one of his own personal guns. Are maybe some of the inconsistencies in Martin's statements, like this one, the reason Gilbert believed he could be a suspect in his brother's death? The gun belt is another confusing detail, because Martin says he gave it to the family. The family says they never got it. But then they claim after Myrtle's house is burglarized, someone has stolen a bunch of items related to Robert, and among them is his gun belt. So, did they have it or not? None of this makes a great deal of sense to me. And while Unsolved Mysteries presented the missing gun and gun belt as their strongest evidence that something sinister occurred here, to me it's a blind alley where even if you found the answer, I don't know that it would reveal a great deal about what really happened that night. I think the key to this entire case rests in what the state attorney general's office have listed on their website. They don't say that Hamrick was pulled from his vehicle. They say that he exited it, which to me implies he did so of his own volition. After exiting the vehicle, they claim he was beaten with a tire iron. Where this detail comes from, I can't quite say for sure. Maybe an informant, maybe something they found in their own investigation. Either way, the sheer fact that the AG's office believes this was a homicide that involved Hamrick being beaten outside of his car before being thrown back inside, I think says a hell of a lot about what really might have gone on here. When you step back and view the case through even eyes, you could see it going either way. Could Chief Hamrick truly have died as a result of losing control of his vehicle and colliding with a tree, causing massive head and chest injuries as he bounced around inside of the car? Absolutely. I think both Dr. Tagioff and Dr. Hirsch have made that quite clear. However, is it also possible that Hamrick was somehow forced off the road and then assaulted with a blunt object like a tire iron before being thrown into his cruiser and left for dead? I don't believe that's a theory which can be simply dismissed out of hand, and apparently neither does the Attorney General. The problem is this. If indeed a cover-up was conducted, then how in the hell can you trust any of the information in those Sheriff's Department reports? That, in and of itself, is a whole different issue with this case. So what do you think happened? Was this an accident? Was it something more? Was there a cover-up? Were members of law enforcement involved? It sounds like back in 1970, there were a lot of things going on under the table in Rock Creek, and perhaps Chief Robert Hamrick's life was sacrificed in order to keep some of that information from ever being discovered. In the end, neither outcome makes it any less tragic. 29 years old, chief of police, and his life is extinguished far too early. Due to the confusing nature of the case and the contradictory details of the investigation, how is his family ever supposed to come to terms with his death when, in the end, they still don't know what really happened? 52 years have passed since Chief Robert Hamrick succumbed to his injuries in the Cleveland Clinic. For the vast majority of those years, his case has remained closed by both the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department and the BCI. The AG's office, it seems, is the only body remaining that believes there's more to this story than just a car accident. Unfortunately, without new information, the discovery of new evidence, or someone coming forward, the mysterious death of Chief Robert Hamrick will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the mysterious death of Chief Robert Hamrick, there's honestly not a lot available online. Unsolved Mysteries did do an episode on the case, though it's very short and full of a lot of inaccuracies. There are some newspaper articles available, but they don't dig too deeply. I would like to take a moment to thank the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department for providing me with their case files, because without them, this episode would not have been possible. If you have any information about the death of Chief Robert Hamrick, please contact the Ohio Attorney General's tip line at 1-855-BCI-OHIO. That's 1-855-224-6446. Also, if you were someone involved in this case and I mentioned you in this episode, or perhaps did not mention you in this episode, I would really love to talk to you about this case. So if you could please contact me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, I'd love to start a conversation with you. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, message me on Instagram at traceevidencepod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Trace Evidence would not be possible without support from amazing listeners like you. And now I'd like to take a moment to thank our fantastic Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Ann Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eloanne Meyer, Eric Sumter, Guillermo Pinto, Haley Christie, James, Jen Trebb, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sense, Joni Berkowitz, Julie Mangano, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Brackeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Orange Patches, Quinn McBreen, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Levanon, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Adorable Susie Summers, Taylor, Tom Archer, Tom Radford, and Tracy Woods. Your contributions to Trace Evidence are invaluable, and your support of the show is both appreciated and extremely humbling. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence and gaining access to exclusive merch and ad-free episodes, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or go to trace-evidence.com and click on the support option. This concludes the deep dive into the mysterious death of Chief Robert Hamrick. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.